presente. Por ahí vamos.
Listo, perfecto, gracias.
Embajada, y después el lunes tenemos Diálogo, ya de los diputados.
Yo estaba viniendo con Federico, pero con el tiempo estaba medio...
Está complicado, eso lo va a complicar.
Sí, no sé.
Está colapsado. Ya está. Sí, no sé, está esa estructura.
Claro, gracias. Yo tuve suerte de buscarle un taxi.
Y
Yo dije,
sí,
no, porque dije, no tengo que... Porque si no,
así que nos avisamos, también los diputados, oposición, oficialismo, también para ese almuerzo, también política. Vamos a hacer de vuelta el programa con las elecciones. 2012 fue el mejor de todos, pero por lejos. Tuvimos el alcalde de Washington, que era la autoridad primaria, que va a ser la mujer. Tuvimos el secretario de Comercio Internacional, tuvimos Tom Kelly, Whitaker. Tuvimos mucha gente.
ya Colombia.
¿Ya se fue a Colombia?
No sé si todavía, pero ya
Se estaba yendo, y Tom Kelly se iba a lanzar, me parece. Sí, se está yendo ahora. Y después el miércoles tenemos jueces.
Bueno, Jeff Brown está allá.
Jeff Brown está
Está
allá.
en Washington.
Sí, y la semana que viene vamos a probar un programa oficial. Como puede ser el calle, como allá Washington y Nueva York. Estamos haciendo proyectos. Ahora, más ritmo interesante. Me parece que todas las cosas, que también las cosas,
Muy bien, hablar es cosas
sí. Así que yo ya hiciste todas las lijas, mandaste.
Porque tenemos chicos, ellos tienen exámenes. Es con él con quien había hablado de Joven.
Ah, sí.
Exactamente. Ahora vamos a tomar.
Qué bueno, si es algo. Qué bueno, ¿cómo le das mis saludos?
Sí, ahora le vamos.
Aquí bien, es fabulosa.
Yo me quería quedar con
Sí. ¿Quién tatuaje acá que no muestra porque
y me encantaba. Pero hoy en mañana es
No hay tiempo, uno no puede estar.
no hay Dios.
Todavía
Tenemos al Papa, pero Dios no está acá, así que vamos a entrar ese ejercicio de la mañana.
pero por favor, dame mis
sí,
saludos.
lo mismo.
Gracias. Sí.
Si recién acabo de hablar con la tenemos que retomar
En el banco que tiene a nivel mundial, también pero con el tiempo, de mi hija, pero no le entiendo.
Mucha gente se confunde cuando lo dice.
¿Cómo estás? Igualmente.
Ella conoce a...
Su esposo, su esposa está trabajando con nosotros.
¿Ah, sí?
Está en Nueva York, no. Pero ella sí acaba de como un mes. Mark es mi esposo. Tú sabes, sí, teníamos, no sé, cantidades.
Ah, sí, ahí
Estuvo analizando por chicas, las chicas, pero las horas, muy impresionante.
Sí, representando instituciones, universidades, Organización Internacional de Jóvenes. Entonces, las universidades se conocen como
Entonces, para que sepan.
No decía nada. ¿Ya estamos acá online?
Sí.
Perdón. Y
Hola, ¿cómo estás? Hace mucho tiempo. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Todo bien? También. Bueno, con esta lluvia se mejor. Tuve suerte de un taxi ahí, que había salido antes y no pudo aquí. Sí, pobrecito ayer estaba como tranquilo. Pero, y él dice que nos puede ver. Sí, no, por eso pienso que se llega y es temprano, cuando él vea. Claro,
se pudo bajar sin problemas, ¿no? La presentación de PowerPoint.
No, esta compu tiene la transmisión en vivo.
Hay
otra.
La que está trabajando. Hay un lugar de firma. Siento que lo lleva. Eso básicamente. Y estaba
Si quieren escuchar lo de la sala.
Hola, 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 hola. Pero y eran bueno. Así que no, sí. Podría. Sí, de acuerdo, está bien.
¿Funciona?
Sí, porque estoy conectada a la banda.
Doctor Flamm, siempre diciendo que no, y entonces, vos estás acá con
No, yo estoy transmitiendo en vivo. Las diapositivas pasan de allá.
Ah, directamente.
Sí.
No, no, vos estás. No, no. Lo veo en televisión. Tenés entonces el... ¿Está funcionando? ¿El audio? El audio. No es... Ah, bueno. Si la enchufas, te escucha la máquina. Si la máquina funciona, pero cuando enchufas, le llega. Ah,
Buenas tardes. Bienvenidos al Consejo Argentino para las Relaciones Internacionales. Es un gusto tenerlos a todos aquí. En particular, a jóvenes que seguramente van a aprender muchísimo más como todos nosotros. Bienvenido, profesor. Gracias a la Embajada de Estados Unidos y al Comité de Estados Unidos del Consejo Argentino. Esta presentación del profesor Flamm se inscribe dentro de una serie de presentaciones que el CARI hace tiempo está realizando sobre la figura del presidente Kennedy. Recordaba el homenaje público que se hizo en esta casa también a los 50 años, el aniversario del atentado y la muerte, y por lo tanto un recuerdo muy emotivo en ese momento sobre una de las grandes personalidades de la historia del continente. Hoy la presencia del profesor se inscribe dentro de esa misma tónica. Las sociedades se dan próceres, hombres ejemplares, a los cuales imitar. La elección de esas figuras estelares o próceres habla mucho de cada país y de cómo se eligen esas figuras estelares a las cuales seguimos. Es una especie de faro para la nación en su conjunto y en particular para nuevas generaciones que heredan la posta de la continuidad de las naciones. Tanto en Estados Unidos como en cualquier país, eso sucede. Para nosotros argentinos, una figura como la de Kennedy, que tanto tuvo que ver con nuestro país, y en particular con el Consejo Argentino para las Relaciones Internacionales, constituye una de esas figuras estelares, imitables, a lo cual creo que hay que atender, conocer en profundidad. Por eso la presencia del académico hoy reviste un particular interés. Esta casa que busca mayor conocimiento, mayor seguimiento de este tipo de personalidades, un mayor acercamiento con todos los países del mundo y en este caso en particular con Estados Unidos, justamente está cumpliendo con el objetivo de su fundador Carlos Manuel Muñiz, si logra todas estas cosas. La política internacional tiene un plano moral que es tan importante como todos los aspectos, o quizá más importante que todos los aspectos que guían la política internacional. Este fue un hombre con ideales, un hombre con una altísima moral, y un hombre que en última instancia, por eso hoy decimos que constituye un ejemplo. Profesor Flamm, muy bienvenido.
Buenas tardes a todos, gracias por estar acá. Ante todo, quiero señalar que esta es una reunión que está patrocinada y organizada por la Embajada de Estados Unidos, y la representante está acá mirando la representante, la secretaria de Sección de Asuntos Culturales, por el Grupo Joven del CARI, la Fundación Diálogo Americano y por el Comité de Estados Unidos del CARI. Es decir, es un esfuerzo conjunto. Michael Flamm, que ya hace 7 años conversó el Comité de Estados Unidos del CARI sobre un tema muy interesante que es el Tea Party como fenómeno político, ideológico del sistema político de Estados Unidos. Es profesor titular de Historia de los Estados Unidos en Ohio de Wesleyan University. Se especializa en temas de historia contemporánea posterior a la Segunda Guerra Mundial, particularmente en momentos culturales, políticos y sociales. Estudió historia en Harvard University y luego obtuvo un máster y un doctorado en la misma disciplina en Columbia University. Es autor de varios libros, en los que se destacan Debating the American Presidency, American History, 1965 to the Present, Debating the 1960s, Liberal, Conservative, and Radical Perspective, Law and Order, Street Crime, Civil Unrest, and the Crisis of Liberalism in the City. También ha publicado numerosos artículos en prestigiosas revistas especializadas internacionales. Le doy la palabra, antes de escucharlo a Flamm, a la representante de la Embajada de Estados Unidos.
Qué gusto que todos están aquí con nosotros, sobre todo en una noche tan lluviosa. Creo que es una referencia de la importancia de CARI y del trabajo que se hace conjunto con el Diálogo Argentino-Americano y con el Comité de Estados Unidos. Y gracias a Michael Flamm y también hablando sobre el presidente Kennedy. En verdad, esta noche no es la primera vez, como ya se ha dicho, que el profesor Flamm está aquí. Estuve aquí en el 2010 como parte del programa de Fulbright y estuvo un semestre con la Universidad de San Andrés. Y no es casualidad que lo tenemos aquí de vuelta, porque hizo un trabajo tan bueno en ese entonces, hablando también aquí del Tea Party, que le pedimos que regrese y que hable justo, sobre todo con los jóvenes, que es un placer ver tantos jóvenes aquí, porque las historias que aprendemos del presidente Kennedy y de tantos de nuestros antecedentes es una manera de que podemos seguir adelante. Así es que, de verdad, es un placer tenerlo y participar en esta oportunidad. Así es que muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Bienvenido, gracias por venir. It is a great pleasure and honor to be here once again with all of you at CARI. Thank you for the invitation. And I hope everyone can hear me. I hope everyone can understand me also. Last November, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of John Kennedy's tragic, untimely death. And it was an opportunity for many of us to examine the central paradox of John Kennedy's life and death, which is that today he is far more popular with far more Norte-Americanos than he was in November 1963. So the question we need to consider is, why is John Kennedy more popular in death than he was in life? And what does that say about history, about memory, about culture in the United States and around the world as well? Because John Kennedy is today very much an international figure. He belongs to the world, not simply to the United States. What I want to do this evening is talk briefly, Professor, briefly, and then give you an opportunity to ask questions and make comments. That's what I would like to do. So I will move quickly and perhaps go over things that you know and don't know, but I promise you will have time to ask questions and make comments at the end. I want to begin by sharing some images of John Kennedy and his family. It is important to understand that John Kennedy was born into the closest thing we have in the United States to a royal family. The Kennedy family, very prominent and very powerful. That is, of course, his father, Joe Kennedy, who was the ambassador to Great Britain, the first Securities and Exchange Commissioner on Wall Street, a legendary and powerful figure. I do want to remind everyone, John Kennedy was Joseph Kennedy's second son. Joseph Kennedy hoped and expected that his first son, Joe Kennedy Jr., would become president, but he died in military service during World War II. Here's a photograph of John Kennedy with his younger brothers, Robert and Ted Kennedy, who passed away just a few years ago. John Kennedy, like many men of his generation, served in World War II. He was a junior officer in the U.S. Navy, captain of the T-boat. After the war, he made the decision to go into politics. This is a photograph of John Kennedy campaigning in 1960 in the state of West Virginia. As you know, John Kennedy faced a significant handicap when he made the decision to run for president in 1960. He was hoping to become the first Roman Catholic elected president of the United States, and he made a courageous decision to confront religious prejudice directly, to ask people in the United States not to vote for him because he was a Catholic, but also not to vote against him because he was a Catholic, to make religion irrelevant in American politics. Part of the reason I will argue for Kennedy's continuing appeal is that he is the first celebrity president in U.S. history. He is the first politician to combine looks and appeal to become more than a political figure. He is a movie star. He is a rock star. And you can see from photographs like this, people simply want to touch him, to come close to him. You may also notice that there is no real security in this photograph. The Secret Service was not protecting candidates at this time. You may also know that John Kennedy became president in 1960 largely as a result of a very famous television debate that he had with his opponent, the Republican Richard Nixon. I recently learned the startling fact that there has never been a televised presidential debate here in Argentina. That's a very interesting point for me to have discovered. As I believe many of you know, we have studies in the United States. People who listened to the debate between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy believed that the debate was a draw or that Richard Nixon won the debate. But Americans who watched the debate on television overwhelmingly believed that John Kennedy won the debate because John Kennedy looked and sounded wonderful on television. And another point, John Kennedy is our first television president. He is the first president to truly take advantage of television and take advantage of this powerful medium, not to present policies, but to present an image of himself and the United States. And this is a second point I want to stress. Part of John Kennedy's enduring appeal is because he represents a moment in time when the United States felt extraordinarily good about itself and about its place. And so it's the association of the time, the early 1960s with John Kennedy, that also, I believe, contributes to his lasting appeal in the United States and the world. He is elected president by a very narrow margin in 1960, and I do need to remind you, at the time of his death, in November 1963, it was by no means clear that John Kennedy would win re-election in 1964. It was very possible that he would lose. He was in Dallas to raise money and raise support for his re-election campaign. Today, of course, if John Kennedy was alive, he would win easily. But in 1963, that was not the case. He faced a great deal of opposition. And of course, once he is elected, John Kennedy excites the American people by issuing a challenge to a new generation of Americans. He says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. John Kennedy wants to channel the idealism, the excitement, the optimism that young people in the United States are feeling in the 1960s, and that is tremendously exciting. Now, what about the Kennedy record, the actual record that he accomplishes? Let me stress, John Kennedy is in office for less than 1,000 days, less than 3 years. That means that at best, you can give John Kennedy, if he was a student, an incomplete. If he was my student, I would give him an incomplete, because he didn't have a chance to finish most of the projects that he began. And this, I think, is the third reason why John Kennedy's legacy is so powerful. We are able to project onto John Kennedy the assumption that if he had lived, he would have accomplished great things, and he would have avoided great mistakes, like the Vietnam War, for example. And so it's the incomplete nature of his life and his presidency that allows us to assume the best and avoid the worst. John Kennedy proposes a tax cut. The tax cut helps the economy grow. How much it helps the economy grow is a debate among scholars in the United States to this day. Conservatives believe that the Kennedy tax cut was responsible for much of the prosperity of the 1960s, and of course tax cuts are very much part of the conservative economic program in the United States. Many scholars argue that the tax cut had only marginal significance. The U.S. economy would have prospered in the 1960s without the Kennedy tax cut. But this is a point of debate, and we can argue about it if you wish. Kennedy, of course, launches the U.S. mission that will culminate in 1969 with the placing of a man on the moon. This is, I think, yet another reason for Kennedy's enduring appeal. He challenges the United States to reach for greatness, to literally reach for the stars or the moon. John Kennedy refuses to believe that the United States has to settle, that the United States has to accept anything less than the completion of their dreams and ambitions. This is very important. This, of course, Apollo 11 in 1969. Civil rights. This is an area where many Americans believe that John Kennedy would have accomplished great things if he had lived. The historical record, I must tell you, is more complicated. John Kennedy was a late convert to the cause of civil rights. He was not an early supporter of civil rights. He believed it would jeopardize his re-election by costing him the support of many white voters in the South who were opposed to civil rights. By the spring and summer of 1963, John Kennedy has decided to support Dr. King and the civil rights movement, but it is a late development. Nevertheless, in June 1963, Kennedy introduces a civil rights bill in Congress, and he gives a very powerful speech. In the speech, John Kennedy declares that civil rights is not simply a political issue. It is not simply a constitutional issue. It is a moral issue. And he makes it a moral challenge to people in the United States that they deliver on their promise of equal opportunity to all Americans, regardless of race. Would John Kennedy have been as successful with civil rights as his successor, Lyndon Johnson? This is a very open question. I must tell you, I will give you my opinion right now. I do not think that John Kennedy could have pushed either the Civil Rights Bill or the Voting Rights Act of 1965 through Congress. It required his death. It required sympathy for his successor, Lyndon Johnson. And in my opinion, it also required Lyndon Johnson's extraordinary ability to manipulate Congress to get these measures through. But again, that is my opinion. There is room for debate. You are certainly welcome to challenge my opinion. John Kennedy is a committed Cold Warrior. I need to stress this point because there are many people today who believe that if John Kennedy had lived, he might somehow have brought the Cold War to an end, might have improved relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. John Kennedy believed in monolithic communism. He believed that all communists everywhere, whether Cuban or Vietnamese or Soviet or Chinese, were part of an effort to destroy freedom and democracy and capitalism around the world. He believed that every country had to choose whether it was going to side with the United States or with the communist world. John Kennedy believed in the domino theory. He believed that the loss of even one small country to communism could cause other countries in the region to fall to the communists as well. And yet, unlike many conservatives, John Kennedy did not believe that war with the Soviet Union was inevitable. He believed that the United States and the Soviet Union could coexist peacefully until at some point in the future, the Soviet system, the communist system would collapse and capitalism would triumph. And so this last belief of his, this belief in peaceful coexistence, is why I think many people today believe that if John Kennedy had lived, he might have ended the Cold War decades before it actually ended. I don't agree with that particular belief, but it's part of his appeal. John Kennedy, I think, is popular in the world because John Kennedy believed that there were ways for the U.S. to extend its influence beyond military means. The Alianza para el Progreso was a popular program. So was the Peace Corps. In many respects, John Kennedy is the father of what today we call PTP diplomacy, person-to-person diplomacy, believing that the Peace Corps and the Fulbright program, these are ways for the United States to extend its influence around the world more effectively, perhaps, than through military or economic pressure. And this is, I think, this represents the more idealistic side of John Kennedy. And I think it's important. John Kennedy balances both realism and idealism. And he thereby offers something for everyone. He offers the realism for the people who consider themselves realists, but he offers the idealism that inspires young people and others. John Kennedy makes terrible mistakes early in his presidency, such as the Bay of Pigs. But he learns from those mistakes. He learns from those mistakes. He learns to trust his own judgment. He learns not to defer automatically to generals and admirals who tell him that operations will succeed. This is also part of Kennedy's enduring appeal in history and memory. He seemed to be growing in office. He seemed to be growing and changing, and therefore we can be optimistic that he would have continued to grow and change. But we also know that John Kennedy, until he died, never gave up hope that the U.S. would find a way to remove Fidel Castro from power in Cuba. John Kennedy supported and sanctioned efforts by the Central Intelligence Agency to remove Castro from power by many different kinds of means, including assassination plots and whatever. And I think that's important to bear in mind as well. He learns from the mistake at the Bay of Pigs, but he never abandons hope of removing Fidel Castro from power in Cuba either, not until his assassination. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 is another interesting moment for Kennedy. You can praise John Kennedy for not using the military to resist the construction of what will become the symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall that divides East Berlin and West Berlin. John Kennedy himself says of the Berlin Wall, it's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. That's exactly what he says. A wall is better than a war. But you must know, many conservatives look at the Berlin Wall and see John Kennedy as someone who is willing to concede to the communists, not willing to confront the communists, not willing to pursue the Bay of Pigs operation to success, not willing to oppose the construction of the wall. And then, of course, there's the famous Cuban Missile Crisis. You are no doubt familiar with the story. I am not going to repeat it for you here. I do want to tell you what we now know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, 50 years, more than 50 years after the fact. We first of all know that the world came much closer to nuclear devastation than we realized. At the time, at one point, we now know a U.S. plane, a spy plane, a U-2 mission, strayed accidentally into Soviet airspace. We know that the Soviets sent 2 fighters to intercept that U-2 plane. We know that the U.S. Air Force sent 2 planes up to intercept the Soviet fighters and protect the U-2 spy plane. We know that the fate of the world was in the hands of junior U.S. officers who had been given the authorization to use air-to-air missiles if necessary against Soviet fighter pilots. The world is extraordinarily fortunate that both those Soviet pilots and those American pilots did not act, because John Kennedy was not in control of that situation, and neither was Khrushchev. From a diplomatic standpoint, we know that John Kennedy immediately revealed the existence of those missiles to the American people. There is a great debate among scholars of foreign relations in the United States as to whether that was a wise move or a foolish move. By revealing the existence of the missiles publicly to the American people, he reduced his negotiating options. Now that may have been wise, because that may have communicated to the Soviet Union the seriousness of his intentions, but it also limited his ability to diffuse the crisis quietly behind-the-scenes negotiations. Many of you I know in this room are experts in diplomacy. You've spent your careers in diplomacy. There is often a debate over whether it is wise to negotiate in public or whether it's better to negotiate in private. This is a moment where we can debate whether John Kennedy pursued the proper course of action. We do know that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States concludes its first treaty with the Soviet Union designed to limit the testing of nuclear weapons, this test ban treaty. But we also need to understand that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both the Soviet Union and the United States escalate the nuclear arms race. And so again, the question of whether John Kennedy would have been a warrior for peace and bring the Cold War to an end, the historical record suggests otherwise. And then there is the question of what John Kennedy would have done in terms of Vietnam if he had lived. This is in some ways the greatest unanswered and unanswerable question of the Kennedy presidency. John Kennedy inherits a bad situation in South Vietnam. The communists are gaining influence, gaining power. The leader of South Vietnam is increasingly unpopular with his own people. John Kennedy dramatically increases the number of U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam. There are approximately 3,000 military advisors in South Vietnam. When he comes into office, there are 13,000 military advisors in South Vietnam by November 1963. And you can also put that word advisor in quotations. Many of those quote-unquote advisors are participating in military operations. They are carrying weapons. They are receiving combat pay from the Pentagon, from the U.S. military. Even that term advisor should be used carefully. Images like this are coming out of South Vietnam. This is the famous photo I know many of you have seen of the Buddhist monk who sets himself afire to protest the policies of the South Vietnamese government. And as many of you know, in October 1963, weeks before John Kennedy was killed, John Kennedy approves a CIA plot to support a coup by generals in South Vietnam who want to overthrow Diem and replace him with a stronger leader. And then a few weeks later, Kennedy himself is killed. This photograph is one of my favorites. This question of what would John Kennedy have done if he had lived? Would he have led the United States into South Vietnam, into the jungles and rice paddies, or would he have found a way to keep the United States out of a conflict that ultimately causes a great deal of dissent at home? Here is my opinion, and I will tell you right now, it is debated and contested, and we can discuss this as well. I believe that John Kennedy would have placed U.S. combat troops in South Vietnam in 1965 if he had lived and if he had been reelected president. But I don't believe he would have put 500,000 troops in South Vietnam by 1968. I think one of the lessons that John Kennedy learns from the Bay of Pigs is the danger of over-committing military resources to a conflict. John Kennedy was reluctant to commit military forces to the Bay of Pigs operation because he feared that the U.S. might become bogged down in the mountains of Cuba. That caution, I believe, would have kept him from making the kind of commitment to South Vietnam that Lyndon Johnson made in 1965. But now we are in the world of hypotheticals and counterfactuals, so you may disagree with me and raise this issue as well. I do want to talk a little bit about the Kennedy mystique. This is very important. John Kennedy's enduring appeal as a political figure is based, I would argue, largely on his image. His image as a sophisticated, glamorous, young political figure. There is no doubt that John Kennedy benefits tremendously from his association with Jackie Kennedy. And in fact, this is another point that I want to stress. I do not think that John Kennedy would be nearly as popular as he is today without the extraordinary appeal of his wife, Jackie. And this is especially true when you look at the international appeal of the Kennedys. As I think many of you know, Jackie Kennedy spoke Spanish. She also spoke French and Italian. There is a very famous story that when Jackie Kennedy and John Kennedy traveled to France and met de Gaulle, Jackie Kennedy charmed everyone, French reporters as well as de Gaulle, because she could speak French. And in fact, there's a very famous story, it's true. John Kennedy, in a teasing but somewhat serious tone, began to refer to himself as the man who had accompanied his wife to France. And it's clear that he was a little annoyed at the attention. I will say this, and you can dispute it. I think U.S.-French relations would have been much better if John Kennedy had lived and if he had brought Jackie with him to Paris every time he met with de Gaulle or other French leaders. In fact, many of the tensions between the U.S. and France might have been avoided had he lived. But she is very much part of his appeal, her glamour, her sophistication. has an enduring influence of its own. Her fashion style is also something that has endured as well. Now, unfortunately, the reality, as many of us know, is that their relationship was not the fairy tale that we want to imagine that it was. We now know, of course, that John Kennedy had affairs with many women other than Jackie. But that does not seem to have somehow penetrated the romantic aura that surrounds these two figures in our memories. I also want to tell you that the image here of John Kennedy as this vigorous, athletic, handsome figure is also mostly image and not reality. One of the things we now know about John Kennedy is that he was heavily medicated throughout his presidency. And in fact, so heavily medicated that it's rather disturbing. I would like to read to you now, just for a moment, all of the medications that we now know John Kennedy was taking during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US and the Soviet Union came closer to a nuclear confrontation than at any other point in the Cold War. Here are the medications that he was taking at that time. He was taking hydrocortisone, testosterone, and salt tablets. That was for the treatment of his Addison's disease, which was a carefully guarded secret, not shared with the cabinet or with the American people. He was taking an anti-spasmodic because he suffered from spastic colitis, what we in the United States call irritable bowel syndrome. No one in the room suffers from that. Antibiotics for a urinary tract infection. He was taking Ritalin, which is a stimulant. He was taking Librium for anxiety. Naturally, because he was taking Ritalin, he couldn't sleep, so he had to take barbiturates for sleep. He took codeine, Demerol, and methadone for pain. He had a bad back. Many of you know he had a bad back. So he's taking pain medication for those diseases. And he is readily taking amphetamines as well during this crisis. This is also part of the Kennedy record, which is sort of Kennedy. And now I want to talk a little bit about the American moment, because I do think this is critical. John Kennedy's appeal, as I said, has to do with the man, but it also has to do with the historical moment. The appeal of John Kennedy has to do with the appeal that this moment in time has for many Americans, but it is also a moment, and I think this is very important for you to recognize, this is a moment when the U.S. image in the world was probably never better and never stronger. It is before Vietnam. It is before many other events that tarnish the image and reputation of the United States. This is a moment, an age of innocence, not just for people in the United States, but perhaps for people around the world as they look at the United States. Not everyone, I want to acknowledge that, not everyone, but for many, many people. And in fact, by the way, I should stress, because I am in South America, that as far as I can tell, the Kennedy image was stronger in Western Europe than in other parts of the world, because the U.S. commitment to defend Western Europe was so clear and so strong in the early 1960s. What does John Kennedy represent to people around the world, but particularly in Europe? He represents an almost European or international or cosmopolitan. This is something that people, I think, in the United States don't recognize. Like President Obama to some extent, John Kennedy seems more than American. More than American. His wit, his urbanity, his sense of irony, these are not characteristics that are always associated with politicians in the United States, but they're qualities that John Kennedy possesses. At the same time, John Kennedy embodies the glamour, the affluence, and above all, the modernity associated with American culture in the 1960s. John Kennedy represents, particularly for young people around the world, all of those qualities that the United States seems to be bringing to the forefront. Blue jeans, rock music, Hollywood films, Coca-Cola, I don't know. You can think of all of these American products that seem to represent modernity at that particular moment. As I've mentioned, this is a moment of innocence. And in fact, I must tell you, many scholars would argue that November 1963 represents the loss of innocence in the United States. Prior to November 1963, everything seems possible. After November 1963, suddenly there is doubt. Suddenly there is uncertainty. And that is profoundly troubling. Because soon, these are the images that become associated with the United States. Horrific images from Vietnam. This is an image from Birmingham, Alabama, the bombing of a black church, the murder of 4 little girls that takes place in the fall of 1963. These are images, this image, these are images that tarnish the reputation of the United States in the world and destroy that sense of innocence, that sense of possibility, that moment that John Kennedy represents. I'd like to share with you a couple of quotations before I sort of conclude my comments. Here's a comment from a Norwegian intellectual. My former enthusiasm for all things American was replaced by a deep perplexity, often a despondency. Here's a quote from a French scholar. Vietnam, he wrote, shattered the myth of American infallibility. Or a comment from a British historian. The guardian of the ideals of the free world now turned out to be just like the rest of us, sinful and corrupt. And I think that quotation is very revealing. The death of John Kennedy and the events that come afterward sort of destroy this idea, this image, that the United States could somehow be above the world, beyond the corruption and sin that the rest of the world enjoyed. And of course, by 1968, the world was in rebellion, not simply the United States, but the world. A younger generation is protesting what is happening from Paris to Berlin, from Egypt to Mexico City, from Prague to Seoul. There is a generation in rebellion. The moment of innocence, that moment of 1963 is gone. And it cannot be recovered and replaced. Let me simply end with a brief word about Kennedy's assassination, because I think the way he dies is central to his appeal as well. In the United States, the Kennedy assassination continues to fascinate. Books come out every single year. Conspiracy theories proliferate. The internet has become a wonderful tool for people to discuss and pass on their theories of who may have killed John Kennedy and why. Why do these theories remain so popular and so powerful? Because people in the United States simply don't want to believe that on November 22nd, 1963, someone as extraordinary as John Kennedy could have been taken so young, he was a father of young children, by someone as insignificant as Lee Harvey Oswald. Americans simply don't want to believe that, and I would argue, I think many people in the world don't want to believe that someone could have done something like that. As many of you know, there was a Warren Commission report, which was chaired by the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. It concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. That conclusion is not accepted by a majority of people in the United States, and I do not believe it's accepted by a majority of people around the world, although I think plenty of serious scholars do accept it, and we can talk about it. We will skip all of these assassination theories. You may bring them up during the question and answer period if you wish. I simply want to end with this comment, and then I will welcome your questions and your comments, and simply say this. The fundamental reason, in my view, for John Kennedy's lasting is that he emerged at the perfect historical moment. He embodied the nation's desire for activism and for a renewed sense of national purpose. John Kennedy challenged America to pursue greatness And that's what it wanted to pursue at that moment. And then, his assassination, it has left him forever handsome, forever beautiful, forever young in our minds and our memories. The myth of Camelot, the myth of King Arthur and his knights, that myth of Camelot, that bright, shining moment in time, it survived. It survived. Because in the United States, and I would argue in the world, but especially because in the United States, perception matters more than reality, especially if you die young and leave a beautiful corpse, which is precisely what John Kennedy did. Gracias.
Yo creo que el profesor Flamm ha hecho realmente una brillante exposición.
Then with the other Latin Americans went to Washington, went to Joven. Then obviously coming to him, look, that you told that to a person, a lawyer who is Argentine as a foreigner. So then the following day he told me, well then, sorry, I thought you were joking. I was so shocked because really, when he said, so far, I'm a Republican, I felt that he really didn't care at all. And I always said in that joke at all. So that is my terrible experience, my first experience. I really admire Kennedy at that moment. But that shock really for the first time on something.
Professor, you know how both parties in the US have their own father figures. The Republicans often look back to Ronald Reagan. So, in what way would you say that Kennedy's presidency and his period has shaped the way Democrats can see politics and how they look back to what those years?
That is a very good and interesting question. The answer is that, interestingly enough, John Kennedy now transcends political division. That is what is quite extraordinary. The reaction that was shared a moment ago, polls show that Republicans are now as likely to look favorably upon John Kennedy as Democrats are, as they reflect back. And that to me is fascinating. In some respects, John Kennedy may be our last post-partisan political figure, which is a very interesting idea to consider. As many of you know, political polarization and partisanship has been growing in the United States very strongly over the last 30 or 40 years. Kennedy may very well represent our last post-partisan or above partisanship political figure. And of course, it's primarily because of the nature of his death and the nature of our memories, because at the time, he was a very controversial figure, and conservatives and Republicans were strongly opposed to his re-election. So, I mean, that's
Bueno, gracias por la pregunta. Usted habló de que el presidente Kennedy fue el primer presidente de imagen hacia la población, simpatía, aceptación en casi todos los ámbitos internacionales, nacionales. Si usted tuviese que hacer una comparación con lo que vino después, salvando las diferencias entre Bill Clinton y Ronald Reagan para los republicanos, ¿cómo lo ubicaría? Porque Clinton también tiene una gran imagen, que Ronald Reagan también la tuvo, aunque le tocaron también tiempos difíciles como a Kennedy, como a Clinton. ¿Cómo podría hacer una comparativa si es que se puede?
You asked a very good question to compare the impact that John Kennedy has in comparison to other presidents like Ronald Reagan, for example, or Bill Clinton. Ronald Reagan very consciously borrows certain leadership styles from John Kennedy. Relentless optimism, challenge, focusing on a better future, a vision. John Kennedy has a vision for where he wants the United States to go. He wants to put a man on the moon. He wants to achieve greatness for the United States. And Reagan consciously takes from him that lesson that leaders are most effective when they present shiny vision, a direction for where they want the country to go, whether it's a liberal vision or a conservative vision. Bill Clinton is particularly inspired by John Kennedy's emphasis on generational politics, on inspiring and mobilizing a certain segment of the population based on their youth and their age. And your question also leads me to another comment I did not make before, which is that another source of Kennedy's lasting appeal is that he is, in a very real sense, the first baby boomer president. And so his death takes this generation, this enormous demographic cohort of the United States, the baby boomers who are born in 1946 and 1964. He is their first great political leader. And so his death is intimately connected to their youth and the promise of their lives at a particular moment in time. And also, I think, sadly, a vision of mortality that we all face. So absolutely, Kennedy has had a very strong influence on subsequent presidents. Pardon?
Thank you very much for your for your brief presentation about John Kennedy. I think the last century, as every century, has had a point man. I mean, but until John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the indispensable men of the century, all of them were born in the 19th century, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and particularly Winston Churchill, and even Joseph Stalin. Without him, Hitler would conquer Russia and eventually would play a stalemate with the United States. But John Fitzgerald Kennedy, born in 1917, was not only the first president born on that century, but I think if Shakespeare would live in the 20th century, would eventually would take Kennedy as a character, because you mentioned the Kennedy paradox, and I agree with you with that, because to begin with, Kennedy was not to be anointed to be the president, neither within the inner circle of his family. Secondly, even as senator, well, he was in the room around with George Mother and others. The job was to chase other people's secretaries of the Senate, but not until 1960 he realized that he could fight for the ticket. And then, if there are two opposite figures, were John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, which certainly Johnson never belongs to the inner circle of Camelot or the Kennedy family or whatever.
Actually, the figure that I like to look at or compare to John Kennedy is Richard Nixon. Because the comparison there is very close. They are both, as you say, born in the 20th century. They both served as junior officers in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and their military service is very important. They both entered politics in 1946, and they also represent sort of two sides of the American character. I've spoken about John Kennedy. Richard Nixon represents the struggling, striving individual who is not born into great wealth, who is not handed opportunity, but must fight for everything that he gets. And it's striking that they then run into each other.
I think Richard Nixon would have a character at Shakespeare.
Absolutely. Richard Nixon was certainly a figure.
Because it was like a Salieri to
Exactly. If you were going to write a Shakespeare play about John Kennedy, yes, you would want to use Richard Nixon as your Salieri. Absolutely.
He never understood how this young man to have everything. He never good looking, charming, and on the other side, he was the fighting politician. He never understood how he could be defeated by this young man.
I do want to let some others down. We can talk more after, perhaps. I do want to just share one other thought. I've often shared this with students. I like to sometimes tell students in the United States that John Kennedy is who Americans wish they were, and Richard Nixon is often who they actually are. That may be too harsh or too critical, but I think that. But we'll come back to your point. I want to. Is there a question over there? Yes.
Thank you, Mike. It's
Good to see you.
Thanks. I just want to share an anecdote. It happens that my mother was secretary of former president of Argentina, Dubois had a really good relationship with John Kennedy, exchanged a lot of mails and stuff. It happens that in 1961, 1962, they had a meeting, a personal meeting, private meeting, in the framework of the Organization of the States. And in that meeting, I want to recall this anecdote that, as far as I remember, Arturo used to say that when John Kennedy comes into the group, he comes with his personal translator, and Felice comes with his personal translator. Then John tells him, privately, I'm not sure in Spanish or either in English, Arturo, do you trust the translator? Yes, I do. Why? So we stick with yours. So it was quite interesting because we called me this idea of the coexistence. He probably was the only one who really trusted that people could coexist. And that's why he probably wanted to just talk about this without doing this translation.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that.
I wanted to ask you about, you said that Kennedy was born particularly of a royal family. I don't think so. They were Catholics, they were outsiders. Nobody, I know many people who just detested them. People who were in the area, in the Boston and the area that thought that the Kennedy were idolists, etc. So I think one of the very interesting things is the first Catholic president. Now we have the first black president. I think it's very, very important. And it's very important, as you mentioned this, that he was absolutely, he believed in total separation between the church and the state. And that was very clear when he proposed, gave support to public schooling, and Cardinal Spellman was, very insistent that he got for the Catholic schools, and he did it. So people who thought that he was going to, have a Catholic master of the White House, that kind of thing. And that was very strong, because to be royal in the United States, you had to be a watchman. And it's Catholic. And I think that's very important. And if it's Fitzgerald, the whole story, it's part of, I think it's part of the charm of the leadership, that it doesn't really come from up. It comes, slowly out. That's
Well, thank you for your comment. I will say that I use the term royal family. The royal family is often not supported by everyone. If you've been in Britain, you know that simply because it's the royal family, there are plenty of Republicans in Britain who don't appreciate the royal family. But I certainly take your point very certainly. He certainly grew up in a world of tremendous Catholic prejudice and discrimination in the United States. And he certainly had to diffuse the fear that he would somehow call the Pope every time he had to make a policy decision of some kind. Your comment also triggered another thought, which takes me back to the gentleman's comment over there. The president, who I think has also very consciously and deliberately modeled his behavior on John Kennedy is Barack Obama. Barack Obama has a very similar coolness and reserve to him. He understands instinctively that television rewards people who hold back a bit. There are many fascinating parallels, I think, and they are, as you point out, they are both also trailblazers or pathbreakers in the sense that they kind of open the door for other, potentially for other Catholics or other African Americans in the future. So I'm glad you made that comparison, because I should have mentioned it's not just Clinton and Reagan, but it's also Obama, who is very clear. And to take that comparison one step further, Obama was also very clear from the beginning: I will be president for all Americans, not simply African Americans. Just as John Kennedy said, I will be president for all Americans, not simply Catholics. Very good.
Bueno, vamos a ir. Quedan 4 preguntas y cerramos. Me sale, Embajada Argentina y cerrar Milagros.
I was going back to your reference to the Islands for Girls. Maybe I was one of the last colleagues in that. But I was wondering, after the Islands for Girls, you were about to see the program for Latin America since 1963, at least that characteristics, those characteristics. The question is, was that Kennedy only inspiration, or was kind of broader support from the factors of power?
As far as I'm aware, as far as we can tell, the Alianza project was not Kennedy's idea. It was brought to him and he supported it, but it was not originally a program that he had put forward. Your comment has also triggered another thought, which I have not talked about. This is an interesting counterfactual and hypothetical. If John Kennedy had lived, and if he had been reelected as president, would he have intervened in the Dominican Republic? Now, this is also an interesting question, given the restraint that he showed, and that's another area. But you're correct about the fact that there isn't subsequent follow-up programs as well. So your comment made me, that's another area where we can speculate and ponder what might have happened.
No, I will continue with what the gentleman said about the Alliance for Progress. Alliance for Progress, like this is the previous one, was planned as a reaction to probably the biggest or most important challenge the United States had in the continent, which was the and in a way, one of the instruments, important instruments that was used and also to set up the alliance.
Let me just point out, in terms of the Alliance for Progress, Kennedy is influenced by the ideas of Walt Rostow, who was an important sort of intellectual thinker, who argued that economic development was critical to move societies beyond the point where they would be susceptible to communist penetration and subversion. And so that's an idea that he does, in fact, strongly support. I just would also mention, when you look at John Kennedy, he does believe in the possibility of peaceful coexistence. He does see that. And I think that's an important point to keep coming back to as well.
I wanted to say that what you have said about Kennedy from this week on, about the paramount role of human dimension of decision makers. You know, it is ultimately the quality of speaking about their ability to judge them, but they know all the technicalities of policy, but how they tackle the context of which they live, you know, how they not get the great person, personality, or not.
I appreciate your comment. I mean, as a historian, I do believe, and I do like to stress the human element in history and policy making, as opposed to a political science that may be more of an institutionalist or may emphasize structural conditions that influence influence the outcomes of policy.
In Spanish, profesor. Kennedy pertenecía a la élite. Si bien no era de una familia patricia, él pertenecía a la élite americana. ¿Puede haber considerado la élite americana que él los traicionó? Porque en el último año él emitió moneda por fuera de la Reserva Federal, quiso imponerle impuestos al petróleo, es decir, se metió con muchos factores de poder norteamericanos. Eso puede haberle costado la muerte.
Did Kennedy's economic policies favor certain elites? I would answer your question by saying yes, but other policies of Kennedy did not favor certain elites. For example, he acted against the industry, the steel industry, which is a very powerful and important industry in the United States. So I don't think you can make a consistent argument that John Kennedy acted for or against the economic interests of elites. Some of his actions did harm certain elites. Others, actions that he took, helped different elites. But I don't see any consistency here in the Kennedy presidency. I hope I've answered your question.
Milagros,
Thank you very much, Mike, for your excellent presentation. As far as we are at CARI, I would like to make a little comment about Kennedy's sympathy with our country. He came here when he was in his 20s. I don't know if you know that. He visited Córdoba because of his father's career. His father was ambassador at London, and he was a really good friend with an Argentine ambassador, who invited him to come to Argentina. So he came here when he was really young, and he facilitated the negotiation we have at that time with our meat exportation center. And Kennedy really well known our country. And he was one of the few presidents that received. He was the president for that is country, and that's why we have some things that we do. And thank you very much.
My pleasure. I do want to tell you, if you're interested in John Kennedy, I strongly recommend a recent biography about his father. It's by an American scholar named David Nasaw, N-A-S-A-W. It is called The Patriot. And it is a fascinating biography of Joseph Kennedy, who was an extraordinary figure. And I think it's fair to say that if you truly want to understand the son, you should study the father. You should learn about the father, because in both positive and negative ways, he definitely takes after his father, and he's clearly a product of his father. So if you are interested, I strongly recommend this biography of Joseph Kennedy also. Highly polemic, yes, that's a nice, very generous way to put it.
Bueno, para cerrar esta reunión, yo vuelvo a agradecer a la Embajada de Estados Unidos, al Grupo Joven de CARI, a la Fundación Diálogo Argentino-Americano, a Michael Flamm. Yo creo que ha hecho una contribución muy importante a lo que es el objetivo central del Comité de Estados Unidos de CARI, que es conocer y entender los Estados Unidos. Conocer, y él a través del caso de Kennedy nos ha dado un enfoque para permitir conocer los Estados Unidos. Y el punto de vista casi de análisis político, ¿cierto? Creo que hoy suele plantearse el punto de vista de la teoría política a partir del trabajo de Joseph Knight, soft power, soft power es el que seduce, convence, ¿no? Es decir, en cambio otro poder político militar que impone. Y creo que lo que ha quedado claro es que el momento en la historia contemporánea de Estados Unidos, donde el poder de Estados Unidos se sostuvo más en el soft power, fueron los 3 años de gobierno de Kennedy. Muchas gracias.